Listen in for common mistakes I see speakers make and what you can do instead on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Hi there, and welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. I don't know about you, but I'm getting really excited for the return of in-person speaking engagements. I'm recording this right now at the end of May 2021, and I already have on the calendar an in-person speaking engagement, or actually two in-person speaking engagements for September, one for January 2022, and then several others that are in the works to select the date. And I cannot wait to get back to it. So we are doing a series right now on the podcast called Speaking Prep as we prepare to return to in-person speaking post-COVID. So last week's episode was all about pitching for speaking engagements. So definitely go back and listen to that one. Next week's episode is on 3 speaking styles that you can use. So be sure to hit subscribe or follow in your podcast app so that you don't miss these upcoming episodes. Now, for today's episode, I'm going to share 5 mistakes that I see speakers make that turn off their audiences. I'm going to share those mistakes with you and tell you what you can do instead. And this applies no matter the size of the audience, the format that you're doing, and whether you're in person or online. I don't know about you, but I'm sure you've attended presentations, whether in person or virtual, where you get frustrated or bored. And perhaps the thought has even crossed your mind to walk out of the session or to close the Zoom window. Now, of course, with online, it's very easy to close that Zoom window and to just leave the session. When you're in person at a conference or an event, it's a lot harder to walk out of the session. But I have been in the audience of sessions and I've seen people walk out. And I've been sitting in the audience wanting to follow them out the door as well because it's been a frustrating experience. It's been boring or the speaker just is not connecting with the audience. Now, of course, I know that you want to deliver a really great presentation and a really great experience for your audience. So you get excellent feedback from them, that you get more speaking invitations, and that you get leads and clients from your presentations. For those of you who are new listeners, welcome. So glad that you are here. At Speaking Your Brand, we help women entrepreneurs and professionals like you clarify your brand message and story, create your signature talk, and develop your thought leadership platform. Our mission is to get more women in positions of influence and power because we have seen that it's through women's stories and visibility that we challenge the status quo and change existing systems. You can find out about our coaching programs at speakingyourbrand.com. This is also where you can find the show notes for every podcast episode that we do and the various podcast series that we've done. So for example, for this episode is number 228. So you just go to speakingyourbrand.com/228. So speakingyourbrand.com/the numbers 228. And you can get the description and all of the links and the related podcast episodes that I mention here. Now, let's get on with the show. Let's talk about these 5 mistakes. Mistake number 1 is when presenters don't have a strong start. Here's what happens. They start all about themselves, their bio, their logos, their background, their entire history, what brought them here, what they've been doing for the past 10 or 15 or 20 years in their career. And you can see this especially when you're at conference sessions and they have their title slide up and then the very next slide is their bio slide. So they have their logos, maybe they have a photo of themselves. And you see this a lot at conference sessions where the speaker will have their title slide and then the very next slide is their about slide. So they'll have their logos, their photo, bio, some history about themselves, and then they'll talk about what brought them to where they are today. And so, yes, you do want to talk about your bio and your credibility, but not at the very beginning of your presentation. Here's an example of why not to do this. So I attended this was a virtual presentation, and I really feel like it was at least 10 to 15 minutes of the very beginning of the presentation was all about the presenter's background, what she's been doing for the past 10 plus years, detail by detail that brought her here today. Now, that would have been totally fine if it was relevant to the content of what she was sharing, and especially if it was relevant to the audience's industry. And in this case, it was not, because she's in a different industry than that particular audience. So yes, she could have mentioned some of these things as credibility boosters and integrated that into the content of her presentation, but instead it really was like a standalone piece, like a bio piece, where she could have just recorded that 10 to 15 minutes as a bio that she was giving to someone, which is not what you want to do in your presentations. And here's why. Because that early in your presentation, the audience doesn't care about you yet. You need to first show them that you are there for them and provoke their curiosity. So here's the solution. Here's what to do instead. Start with audience questions. Ask them some things about their particular goals, their challenges that they're facing, about their industry. That way that they understand right away that you are interested in them and that you're validating that you understand their goals and what's getting in the way, and then how you can help them. You can also start with a compelling story or a cultural reference. So in the case of a compelling story, this could be a story that's related to you. And again, because it will boost your credibility, it will show that. But it needs to be done in a storytelling fashion, not in a here's my resume, here's all my bullet points, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, because really no one wants to hear that. But if you take one particular situation that you had, like one moment in time, one day, that where everything changed for you, or you had a paradigm shift, then you can include that in your opening, and that can then lead into your bio and into your credibility. Here's an example of using a cultural reference. So in a speaking engagement I did a couple years ago in person, I started by showing the video of a Nike ad that starred Serena Williams. So the Nike ad was about women in sport. So I showed, it was a 1-minute ad. So I showed the ad, and then I asked the audience a question. It was an audience of women. What do you think of this ad? What do you think of Nike taking this stance on this social and political issue? Is that the right thing for Nike to do? And so we had a really great discussion around that. And this was a group of about 120 women. So it was a good sized audience, but we still had lots of audience engagement. And then from there, after we showed the ad and had that discussion, then I talked about my background, my credibility, that I do political analysis on TV. So I'm used to talking about politics, and that speaking your brand, we work with mission-based and values-based women entrepreneurs because of our own mission and vision. So it was a very natural segue from the Nike ad and the audience participation into my bio and credibility, instead of them being standalone things. So mistake number 1 is not having a strong start. So make sure that you start with audience questions or a compelling story. Mistake number 2 is when speakers don't have the right level of content. Here's what happens. The content is either too basic for the audience or too advanced for the audience. Now, most of what I see is that the content is too basic and not specific to that audience's industry and goals. And here's the beauty of having a signature talk, is that when we work with our clients on their talk, we identify what the key points are that they want to make, but then they can go into more detail on some of the points, or they can pull back and do more foundational discussion of some of their points based on who the particular audience is that they're going to be presenting to. So here's an example of what happens when a presentation doesn't have the right level of content. I attended one where it was for advanced business owners. So the presenter knew well in advance that these were business owners who had been in business for 10, 20 years, so not beginners. These business owners have also had a lot of training and coaching already because of the host of that particular event had been working with that host for quite a while. But then the presenter comes and starts talking to the business owners about how to identify their ideal customer and why it's so important to identify their ideal customer. Well, I know that these business owners have already done this well before this day. They already know who their ideal customer is. They already know how to target their customer, how to position themselves for their customer. So the content was way too basic. And here's the problem for that speaker, and also for you as a presenter, if you're not sharing the right level of content, is that your audience gets bored. they disengage, and even worse is that they no longer think you're the best solution for them. So for that particular presenter, she's a coach, and I'm sure she does a great job. But for those advanced business owners who are getting this very basic information from her, they're probably thinking to themselves, well, she probably works with new entrepreneurs, and maybe she's not quite advanced enough for me. So you want to make sure that your content and your presentations aligns with the audience so that they automatically see, oh, this presenter understands my problems and my goals and my challenges, and they get me, so that I should work with them. So here's what to do. Here's the solution. Find out where your audience is in their journey. Are they beginners? Are they advanced? What is their goal? What are the obstacles in the way? Here's how to find this out. Talk to the event organizer before your presentation. Ask them a little bit about the audience. If it's a smaller group, they should know pretty well who the audience is. If it's a conference that you're going to do a breakout session at, they should still have a sense of who the audience is. Now, a lot of times at conferences, you're going to have a mix of beginners and advanced. So what to do there is to poll the audience at the beginning of your session. Ask some show of hands questions. I did this when I did a speaking engagement at a podcasting conference a few years ago, again, in person. So it was a mixed group. I knew there were going to be both beginners and advanced podcasters in the audience. So at the beginning, I asked a series of questions. First, I asked what genre of podcast the audience was in. So in this case, I actually had them stand up because I knew they had been sitting for a while, and my presentation was in the later afternoon, so people were getting tired. So I said, okay, if you are in the business of marketing genre for your podcast, stand up. Okay, great. So then people could also look around the room and see who else was in their genre. Okay, sit down. If you're in the health and wellness space, stand up. If you're in like the narrative fiction, stand up, etc. It was fun, got people moving. Then also gave me a sense of who was in the audience. And then I asked for people to stand based on how many years they had been podcasting. So if you've been podcasting for more than 4 years, stand up. If you've been podcasting for 2 to 3 years, stand up. 1 year, not started, etc. So again, I got a sense of who was in the audience, but then the audience also got a sense of each other. So that's a great way to find out. And then, of course, once you have those audience questions at the beginning, then you're going to adjust your content on the fly, and you'll be able to get much better at doing this the more you present your material. Again, this is why having a signature talk is so critical, because you're getting really comfortable with the material that you're sharing. You're able to expand it and contract it, and you're able to adjust the level of content based on that audience. The other way to find out what level of content you should be sharing is to ask on social media, especially if you're attending a larger conference. That conference will likely have hashtags related to their event. And so post on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and use the conference hashtag and start asking questions related to your topic, just to get a sense of how familiar people are with it. And then along with this is understanding your current clients and where they're at in their journey related to your topic. So are they mostly beginners or are they advanced? And then you really want to align your content also with who you want to attract as clients. Because if you're doing a session where it is a mixed audience and you know that you really like to work with clients who are more intermediate and advanced, you probably don't want your content to be beginner level, because then that's who you're going to attract as clients, which is not a great fit for you, and vice versa. So that's also something to keep in mind. Mistake number 3 is having content that is generic and unstructured. Here's what happens. Presenters have lots of information that they want to share. Of course, we are experts in our topic, so we know so many things and we want to share it all in 20 minutes or 45 minutes, and we can't. There's just too much. We can't download all of the 10, 15, 20 years we've been learning this into an audience in that short amount of time. It is up to us as the speakers, as the presenters, to curate that information and to provide the audience with exactly what they need to know today and what they need to know to take the next step on their journey. So content that's generic and unstructured, too much information, it's not tied together, and it doesn't build from one concept to the next. And along with this is what I see with speakers is that they're afraid to give an opinion. They're afraid to give their own perspective on a topic. And by doing so, they are not shifting their audience's perspective. They're not shifting their audience's understanding. And really, what we all need nowadays, more than just information, is we need understanding, perspective, and transformation. Here's an example of a presentation that I attended at a different podcasting conference where the content was generic and unstructured. So the title of the session was something like 20 ways you can promote your podcast. Okay, so number one, 20 ways is a lot. So imagine going to a conference session that's 45 minutes long and the speaker goes through 20 different ways that you can promote your podcast. The problem with this is, number one, I can probably find most of these ways on just by doing a Google search on that particular phrase, and I'm probably going to find it. So the content is generic and undifferentiated. Number two, I'm probably already doing a lot of these ways, but I have to sit through listening through 20 of them to find the ones that may be good nuggets for me to try. Number three, the ones that I'm not doing are getting lost in the noise because, again, I have to sit through all of these and then some of them are for new people, some of them are for advanced podcasters. And most importantly, there's no journey the presenter is taking the audience on. There's no beginning, middle, and end. Are some of these ways better than others? Should you start with some and then move on to others? The presenter isn't giving their expert insight, their expert recommendations on which ones to do. It's better to say, here are 5 ways to promote your podcast if you're just starting out, because that's probably going to be different than if you've been podcasting for 5 years. So that would be a much better session. 5 ways you can promote your podcast if you're just starting out, or 5 ways you can promote your podcast if you've been podcasting for 5 years. So that's where you really want to think back to the mistake that I said earlier, is making sure that you understand what level of content your audience should be listening to. And here's the problem with having content that's generic and unstructured. Number one, it's lazy. Yeah, I'm going to say it. It's lazy because you're forcing the audience to do the work of creating structure and meaning and choosing which are the best ones for them. You're the expert on this topic. And so you should tell me what I should do if I'm launching my podcast this month, or if I just launched it 2 months ago, or if I've had a podcast for 5 years. Tell me which ones to choose based on the particular problem that I'm having. So here's the solution. Have a perspective and understand where your audience is at and share your expert recommendations. Give your audience a new perspective, something new for them to think about. I did this back in March 2020, so a little over a year ago, when I released a podcast episode called A Feminist Approach to Public Speaking. I'll include a link to that in the show notes, which again, you can find at speakingyourbrand.com/228, or just go back in your podcast feed to March 2020 and look for that episode, A Feminist Approach to Public Speaking. And so in this case, I gave the audience a new perspective regarding how public speaking can be approached from a feminist angle. So really interesting. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend going back and doing that. The other thing is that our brains want simplicity. So this is where having a really clear framework comes in. This is the other thing that we do when we work with our clients on their signature talk, is that sometimes they come to us already having a framework in place or an idea of a framework. Sometimes they don't. And so we work with them to help them shape what their framework is. And sometimes it turns into an acronym or an alliteration or even a visual shape. We have frameworks that we use here within Speaking Your Brand. We have our signature talk canvas, which is our 3-act story structure that we use when we work with clients to create their signature talk. We also have our voice thought leadership model. So the word voice is an acronym. We have our ideal story ingredients, and the word ideal is an acronym, and so on. So it makes it really easy for us to then convey this information, and it makes it easy for the audience to absorb it, apply it, and remember it. Mistake number 4 is when speakers have a one-way conversation with the audience. And here's what happens, is that it turns into a lecture. Now, I love school. I was in a PhD program and then ended up leaving with a master's degree. This was in history. And so I thought that I was going to end up being a professor in a university. So I'm all about lectures. I attended many, many lectures when I was in college and graduate school. Well, more so in college, less so in graduate school, because graduate school are usually small seminars. But I would also taught a class when I was in graduate school. I taught a freshman level history class. And even though it was technically deemed a lecture, I didn't approach it that way even back then. I really approached it as having a conversation with the audience, with the students, because I wanted to give them a chance to participate and to share and to answer questions that I was asking. So when you don't give the audience a chance to share and participate, then they're probably not going to remember as much, and they're probably not going to be able to learn as much, because it's through the application of what we're learning is really what helps it to sink in. The solution to this is to build in audience engagement into your presentation. Don't wing it. I think this is what happens a lot of times, is that we build our slide decks, we build our presentations, and then we think to ourselves, well, I'll just wait for someone in the audience to ask me a question to raise their hand, or I'll do Q&A at the end of my content. But if you do Q&A at the end and you're not engaging the audience along the way, they're probably going to zone out. They're going to check out. They're going to be on their phones. They may not be paying as much attention, and then they're not going to be able to apply and remember what it is that you're sharing. So don't wing it. Build an audience engagement into your presentation right from the beginning. And again, this is what we do with our signature talk canvas. It's a poster board with Post-it notes on it. And there's 4 different color Post-it notes, and each Post-it note color represents a certain thing. So we have pink, orange, yellow, and blue. And the orange Post-it notes are for audience engagement. And the reason we use the colors when we work with our clients on their talks is we want to make sure we have a balance of the colors on the board. So we'll go through and then we'll see, there's a section here where we don't have any orange Post-it notes. There's no audience engagement. We need to make sure to go back and add that in. So that's what we do there. Mistake number 5 that I see speakers make is that they rush the end of their presentation, or they have no clear ending at all. And here's what I see what happens is that they end up going over time or getting very, very close to the time of their presentation because of a lack of structure. So they didn't have a clear structure for their presentation. They didn't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And so they didn't know how much time to allot for audience participation, audience engagement, or their stories and examples or their key points went too long. The other thing that I see happen is that presenters will feel awkward mentioning their call to action or mentioning their sales pitch at the end. So they end up rushing it or they skip it entirely. And they kind of, I think, use the excuse that they're running out of time to skip it. And so here's what I hear them saying. They'll say to the audience, well, we're almost out of time now. So thank you so much. Anyone have any 1 or 2 questions that I can take? And the problem with this is that your audience leaves your session on a low instead of a high. There's a thing in psychology called the recency bias or recency effect. And this means that we remember the thing that happened to us most recently. And we also remember the thing that happened to us that had the biggest impact. So during your presentation, if your presentation is 45 or 60 minutes long, most people in the audience will remember the beginning of your talk, especially if it was a great audience question or a really compelling story or a surprising statement that you shared. So they'll remember the beginning. They'll remember something that happened in the middle if it was memorable. And then they'll remember the very, very end. And mostly they'll remember the very, very end. But what speakers do is that they'll go, oh, we're out of time now. Thanks. Any questions? And so that leaves the audience on a low. Instead, you want to leave the audience on a high. So here's what you want to do. You want to have a really strong ending, ideally one that ties back to your opening. So if you started with an opening story, or if you started with an opening video or a cultural reference, bring that back at the end of your presentation. Also, end with an inspiring call to action. Let your audience know that you believe in them, that you know that they can achieve the goals that they have, and that you hope that they take what they learn from your session and start working on it, start applying it. So end with that kind of raw inspiration. I've also ended my presentations with music. So upbeat, good quality music tracks. You can get royalty-free music tracks at sites like premiumbeat.com and epidemicsound.com. Really good quality. So have those music tracks embedded in your slides. And then when you get to the last slide, it will start playing that music. And then you can, of course, adjust the volume, but leave it there and just leave it at that upbeat moment. And then you can take some additional audience questions at the end, but then at least as people are filtering out, they're listening to the music and they're leaving on that high. So let me recap these 5 mistakes that I don't want you to make when you're going out to your presentations, especially as we return to in-person. Mistake number 1 is not having a strong start. So make sure to start with audience questions or a compelling story. Mistake number 2 is not having the right level of content. So make sure you find out where your audience is in their journey and that you adjust the content for them. Mistake number 3 is having content that is generic and unstructured. Instead, you want to make sure that you have a clear beginning, middle, and end, that you incorporate your framework to teach them the key concepts that you want to, and that you give the audience your expert insights and recommendations. Mistake number 4 is making your presentation a one-way conversation. Instead, you want to make sure that you build in audience engagement and participation throughout. And mistake number 5 is rushing the end or having no clear ending at all. Instead, you want to have a strong ending that leaves your audience on a high. So here's what I want for you. I want you to have a confident, clear, and compelling presentation. I want your audience to see themselves in the journey that you're sharing with them so that they get the transformation that they're seeking and that you get the leads, clients, and more and better speaking opportunities that you want. I invite you to schedule a consultation call with us if you'd like to find out how we can work together to create your signature talk and framework. We have worked with hundreds of women entrepreneurs over the past 5 years, and we absolutely love what we do. You'll have your complete signature talk ready to go, feel confident in it, and be able to easily adjust it depending on the audience, the length of time, and the format. You can schedule a consultation call with us by going to speakingyourbrand.com/contact. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/contact, or you can email me at carolcox@speakingyourbrand.com. In next week's episode, I'm going to be sharing with you 3 different speaking styles that you can use. This is going to be a fun episode because if you tend to do one particular speaking style, I'm going to invite you to branch out and to try one of the other 2. Until next time, thanks for listening.